right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started with today's conversation. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Steve Ward. I'll be your session presenter for today. A couple of just little housekeeping things, right? We have phones on mute so we can prevent background noise. I want you to ask questions. You can ask as you go along. I'll answer them in the order received, or you can ask at the end of the session. Probably try and get wrapped up maybe around 2:45 Eastern, so about 45 minutes from now. Give you some of your calendar time back. We will record the session. We will kick a recording of the today's webinar across probably within the next 24 hours or so. Someone from our team will be reaching out with that, and then to ask if you've got any questions that need to be answered, or to see if there's other ways that we can help you. We're here today to talk about an update on what Source Defense saw in our research efforts in Q1 of 2026 around eSkimming. We are seeing a continued evolution in adversarial tradecraft. I will touch on some of the work that we did in 2025 and the year-end summary that we developed there as sort of a refresher. If you haven't seen that information, we have a full report that's available on that. That'll ask my colleague Scott to kick across in the chat window for you. So a link will be coming on that, and for some other documents as we go along as well. Feel free to grab those. If you have any questions about what you read after this session, feel free to reach out to me. We'll put my email address up at this end of the session as well, so you can always reach out with anything you might need. I see a real mixed bag of folks in the conversation today, or in the audience, I guess I should say. Great number of merchants, which is great. This is going to be speaking, I think, a lot to you in terms of what you need to know and understand as it relates to protecting your brand and your consumers. Also some PSPs and some QSAs and some existing clients. Great to see you guys here. Glad that you're keeping up to speed with what's going on, even though you've got our protections in place. And then some new faces that we're happy to help with anything you might need. One of the things that's really important to Source Defense as a brand is being a good steward in the payments community. And so we do things like this to keep the world up to speed on what's going on, to track what's going on with adversaries and what they're doing, so that we can continually evolve our thinking collectively as a community. And so you'll see reports like this and updates like this happening on a quarterly basis throughout this year. And you can avail yourselves of lots of different tools that we have available. Or if you need a session where you need training done or anything like that internal, we're happy to come in and talk to your teams and help educate. So we try and give a community vibe in terms of who we are as an organization. And so with that said, you're a part of our community, and if you need anything, we're here to help. And all you got to do is ask. Okay. So diving into it. I want to refresh a little bit from what we saw in 2025 as far as the year end review key takeaways. Number one, and I think this is a theme that continues itself in Q1 and even sort of at the numerical level proves out, is that we are seeing a proliferation in these types of attacks. They're not slowing down. In fact, they're getting more frequent. They're getting more aggressive, and they are gaining in sophistication. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the tradecraft that the adversaries are using, to try and attack us out there and get their ill-gotten gains. We're seeing a distinct and purposeful evolution in attacks designed to evade controls. And in fact, in Q1 of 2026, saw something pretty alarming that I'll touch on when we get into the summary there. But we obviously, as a community, have been talking about this problem for a number of years now, and have been trying to make strides, to get ourselves, in better position to combat the bad guys. One of the things that's driven us there is, the PCI DSS standard, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, and most of you are probably intimately familiar with it. But one of the things that is always a tough thing in the world of security is that the bad guys can read too, and they know what our controls frameworks look like, and they find the gaps within them. And we're definitely seeing that with respect to what the bad guys are doing out there to try and keep these campaigns being successful. I think there's, as a result, a little bit of a false sense of security that's been created around the compliance structure. And I will be talking throughout today's session about some important things we want you to know, given our experience, over the last 10 years as the pioneer in eSkimming security. Some things that we got to come to grips with, and some evaluation we need to take for ourselves and with ourselves around the difference between compliance and security, because unfortunately there tends to be a difference. We're seeing a lot of additional forms of data theft. Obviously, card data is critically important for us to protect, and it is sort of the cash cow, if you will, that the adversary is after. But we're seeing in these attacks, more forms of data being stolen. I think it's important for us to understand that, credential theft and things of that nature can lead to other forms of fraud and other downstream attacks. And so, especially if you are in an industry that you're not just doing transactions, but you're doing transactions around sensitive data, or you're gathering sensitive data from your consumers, like, I don't know, say you're in the healthcare space, or, pharmaceutical or the pharmacy end of things, you need to understand what the bad guys are doing. And we're seeing a lot of additional forms of data being stolen. We are seeing a very, very specific intent around these types of attacks to be slow and low. It's allowing for persistence over long periods of time. We are seeing a definite increase in capability, to hide and to create attacks that are very, very quiet and are not noisy, and increasingly more and more effort to combat, remediative efforts and to remain persistent, like APTs. So that was kind of like the 2025 overview. We're looking at Q1 of 2026. We have seen an uptick in attacks using first-party scripts. When we talk about the need to prevent eSkimming, it all boils down to, script security, if you will. And I'll talk a little bit, as a quick 101 about what, the DSS calls for. Yeah, it's important to note it's not just third parties that are being attacked. We're seeing a resurgence in first-party scripts being utilized, which means we're seeing, an uptick in server-side attacks that give the adversary a foothold on the back end. And so that's something to be aware of, and we will talk about as we get in here. We're also seeing way more use of silent skimming. It's more the prevalent technique than what you may have, heard referred to as a double entry attack, which is a little bit more noisy, a little bit more easy for a consumer to spot, and maybe even for, your teams to spot with traditional kind of controls. I think it's part of what we're seeing in terms of the, sort of the trend towards slow and low. It's definitely a more sophisticated type of technique, and we're seeing that, pretty much, throughout all of what we saw in Q1 in our analysis. We're seeing a lot of work being put into pixel perfect spoofing. Complete mirror image of what your payment site might look like or your website might look like. Basically creating, a near mirror copy, so that, the campaigns, do not tip off anyone and cause any suspicion. We saw thousands of sites under attack throughout Q1. And it goes back to that proliferation side of things. We're seeing, companies of all types, all sizes across the globe being hit with these types of attacks, and the numbers are growing. That includes major enterprises and mom and pops. I think that we in the industry, maybe trick ourselves into thinking that since we're not seeing, headline after headline, of the latest breach, right? That's like gripping the sort of like news copy, that maybe, this isn't a threat that is, as pronounced as it actually is. It's absolutely opposite to that. It's because of, our lack of visibility. It's because of some adoption issues that we have, as a community, with controls. And we're just not seeing it because the bad guys are doing that slow and low, kind of attacks. One thing that is really, really alarming that we saw in 2026 Q1 is CSP bypass, but more so CSP weaponization. And I will talk about that, in a few moments. Payment page security as well. We are not seeing attacks targeted directly at or originating from the payment page. We're seeing them site wide, and it really is the site wide, sort of attack surface that the adversary is utilizing. Part of that is, because of response to the way the DSS is framed and the focus that it puts, kind of like myopically on the payment page. And then another part of it is the adversaries really never played specifically only on the payment page to begin with. And we'll talk about that as we go along. When we look at this like briefing, it'll be somewhat technical. I try to keep it high level and not get too lost into the weeds, because everybody's skill set's not the same on the subject matter. Our guys can take it way, way deeper and way, way more technical than I will today. But we will be talking about real world threats. Everything that I will be talking about is observed from our research. This is stuff that we saw in the wild. And this is the reality of what we're facing out there. If you want more technical depth, we absolutely can go into that. You can feel free to pepper me with questions at the end, and I'll try my best. But worst case scenario, we can do a technical briefing for you on what we're seeing, and that goes for our existing customers that are on the call, as well as for anybody new, or definitely the QSA community. One of the things that we think is really important as QSAs is that you guys understand what's going on, so that you can provide the proper guidance as the consultative force inside those client interactions or the brand interactions. I'll talk real quick on the 101, but it's going to go beyond the basics. I'm going to speak some uncomfortable truths. I think it's just sort of like our responsibility to kind of maybe speak truth to power around what's going on out there. And then, we'll try and make it interactive. On the background on who we are, you guys may have seen the news, but Source Defense, hopefully you know us. If this is your first time being introduced to us, we've been in market here for 10 years, addressing this problem. We are the pioneer in eSkimming. We support, the entire payments ecosystem. We have relationships from the card brands to merchant acquirers, PSPs, QSAs, 1,000+ of the world's largest brands and countless others, in that level 3, level 4 kind of category. We're a well-known entity. And we were recently recognized, by MasterCard, given our pioneering position, as their partner in this global e-skimming threat. So, we come from a background of knowledge in this space. We come from a sole focus on this space. Our mission in life is protecting data at the point of capture. We look at it as a necessary rounding out of web security, critical to get to that client side. You might hear people talk about it. Also, very important that we be the additive defense in depth. And when we get to some of the conversation around first party attacks that we saw in Q1, I'll bring that back up. We look at ourselves as an enabler of third party service integration, as an empowerer for the business by having source defense and our types of controls in place. You can basically let your business grow and thrive and let your website become more and more complex to deliver the services you need without the security concern. And we really think that, this is an issue both on the third party risk management side of things and 100% as it relates to zero trust. And in fact, I wrote a blog this morning that got published around, zero trust and the fallacy of zero trust when you're not addressing the client side or addressing this e-skimming problem. And so, Scott, maybe you can throw a link to that blog for anybody who's interested, because I know a lot of people have zero trust sort of constructs inside their organization. And so I bring it up to say, you got to think about the website at the same time you're thinking about, zero trust, because you have a supply chain there. We are about addressing data security, data privacy, and compliance, obviously, with DSS. On the privacy side, it's something that goes underlooked, is that even when an attack is not occurring, the fact that you don't have controls over your, sort of website digital supply chain means that you are potentially leaking sensitive information that is privacy protected and that you have other compliance concerns around, in every single, interaction with your consumers. We are a PCI compliant organization. We help with PCI, obviously. We help with GDPR. We help with HIPAA. We help with FFIEC. We're a PCI PPO, Principal Participating Organization. We're a PCI Board of Advisors member. I was on the PCI Small Merchant Task Force and the eSkimming Guidance Task Force. We take our involvement in the community seriously, and that's what gives us this focus on research to continue driving things forward because we want to educate and we want to help and we want to affect change. And so, if you've never been introduced to Source Defense, that's who we are. I think we've got some great bedfellows, if you will, with respect to our relationship with MasterCard. We should be familiar sounding name and faces, as you get more and more engaged on this topic. So the only 101 side of things I'm going to do is just do a quick refresher for anybody who's kind of like, what is this e-skimming thing and how does this work and what is he talking about and what's first party and what's third party and what is just take a little real quick grounding moment and talk about how e-skimming happens and why the DSS requires you to do what you do in terms of script control. Your website's not your website. I mean, it is, right? And you own the brand. If you're a merchant on the call, you own the brand and you own the interaction and you own the data collection and you own the, everything, right? Except for like 82% of the code that's running in every single one of your consumer interactions. Um, Websites are compiled of different services. It's because your teams, rightfully didn't think that they needed to go and build a chatbot, or they didn't need to go and build their own analytics tool, or they can't build, the interconnections to social. They didn't want to create, a video player. Ad tech is not homegrown, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're compiling in all of these different services from all of these parties, and you're doing it, every single time like somebody hits your URL. And because of the fact that there's no visibility over this, environment, it hasn't traditionally been something that's been managed. And because of the fact that all this stuff is JavaScript, you've got a really powerful set of, programming language happening and an ability for JavaScript to kind of do anything it wants. It's like the Wild West inside your consumer interactions. The bad guys know that. They attack your supply chain, and they conduct these attacks by compromising the JavaScript, that is running on your site. And in the, extent that you do have your own services running that first party script, that's where we're seeing more of those server side attacks and the compromise even of your own code. And so you got to manage the code, whether it's first, third, fourth, nth, whatever it is, and you got to get visibility over it because this is how the bad guys basically, that's the Trojan horse of how they're getting in. When they get in and they compromise JavaScript, they can do a lot of things that I think, kind of somewhat overlooked with respect to the structure of the current DSS. And that is, they can change page content. They can add content, images, text, video, form fields that didn't exist. They can redirect visitors to any URL they want. They can change, where links go and where clicks go. And they can record keystrokes. And obviously that's what they're trying to do, then capture and exfiltrate, card data or other forms of PII. And it's really important to understand that because when the DSS tells us we need to focus on payment page security and controlling the scripts that run on our payment page, that's not where the attack happens. And upstream, or you might hear it referred to as like parent page scripts, right? Can be compromised to completely change, the actual consumer flow. And so what's happening in today's environment is not, solely a compromise of a payment page, but it's, compromising a script that's running somewhere else site wide and then changing what your checkout button does, or putting, listeners and keystroke loggers, in place, even inside what you think is like a private, private protected iframe. And so it's a site-wide problem. JavaScript is a problem. The requirements under the DSS focus on payment page, right? So you got to maintain a payment page inventory and have, justification for what's there, and that you have to have a way to assure the integrity, and that you got to monitor payment headers at least once every 7 days, and that you got to respond and alert to all malicious scripts running on your payment pages. All of that's great, but I think that in the threat research that we're seeing, in the real world attacks that we're seeing, site-wide is where our focus needs to be. And it's only through site-wide security that we will be able, to really start, sort of culling this threat, right? And so for those that are clients of ours that may have, started with, a deployment that was more, I've got a, a rock coming up or an AOC or a SAC coming up for my PCI compliance. I'm going to start, with detection in an isolated payment page environment or prevention in a payment page environment. You really should be considering and talking to, our team about expansion. And expansion is easy, and it's not super expensive in comparison to, the threat you're mitigating, and definitely in comparison to where you are. If you're a new client, or trying to solve this problem, we're going to try and guide you in that direction of full payment page protection, or I'm sorry, full site-wide protection, because that's really ultimately where you're going to stop the problem. And if you're a QSA on the call, I'd love to and would welcome interaction with you about what you're hearing from your clients, what your clients are doing, what you're guiding your clients around, and we can help arm you with, sort of that case to be made, for your client to do the security first, not the compliance first kind of deployment. All right. So on the 2025 side of things, we saw tens of thousands of sites attacked. Okay. And this is only what we have visibility into from our sort of modest research team. Like we're not Palo Alto Networks and we're not out there, with researchers all over the place. We're a smaller organization. And this is what we were able to discover in 2025. We saw it across the world. So compromises are happening everywhere. There's no regionally specific targeting. North America, as you might expect, or the U.S., is more heavily targeted, because we just have, a bigger environment of merchants, to go after. But you'll see it all over Europe. You'll see it all over Asia, Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. There have been, recent trends really more towards one-to-many attacks instead of targeted whales. But in Q1, we actually saw, a combination of both, and so what do I mean by a whale? Like a level one merchant or a household name, big box kind of retailer, right? That is popping back up, with some recent discoveries. But mostly what we're seeing is a broad, sort of spray and pray kind of attack surface where it's a one-to-many compromise, a service that's highly utilized. And you can capture, thousands of victims versus, having to go after, one, particular entity to try and get, what you're after. Fashion and apparel, travel and leisure, transportation, media, even government services, we saw all under attack in 2025. I almost said 2015. Wow. In 2025, we were able to see almost 192 distinct campaigns, and so this was not, 92 observed attacks, right? Because we saw thousands of sites under attack. 92 different campaigns, either perpetrated by the same actor group, with just different TTPs, or by a mixed bag of adversaries, because more and more of the scum are entering into the ecosystem to try and jump on the bandwagon, if you will. We saw the compromise of Google Tag Manager, which is really alarming because everybody uses it. I use it on my site. You use it on yours. I'm almost 100% positive. Really, playing into the trust that comes along with services like that. To abuse that trust and to bypass, some of the controls that, have been put in place because of DSS. At the end of last year, we actually saw like what we consider a sort of like attack infrastructure, 52 script modular attack infrastructure, kind of designed as like almost like a launching pad software as a service for eSkimming. And that happened late in 2025, and we've seen more and more indications of that sort of utilization of that type of environment or infrastructure in Q1. In 2025, we were seeing 1,000+ sites in a single campaign, all attacked simultaneously. We saw 15+ languages targeted, and it's really important to understand that there's a lot of sophistication behind localization, and making sure that even down to the use of the right sort of spoofed PSP, that it creates familiarity with the consumer. Lots and lots of different payment platforms attacked, 10 plus in 2025. Tons of services, different services weaponized, all legitimate, abused for attacks. And it gets to, sort of like our need to sort of put that zero trust mentality in place because we're seeing such a mixed bag of these partners or these plugins or however you want to refer to it, these scripts, being compromised, that really there is no sort of pinpointing if there's one, sort of weakness in the supply chain that you have. It's kind of all over the place. In 2026 Q1, it was a busy 3 months. Well, we saw one campaign with more than 2,000 sites involved. So, if we look at like what we were seeing in 2025, it's almost like a doubling, right? In terms of, the reach. We saw, and that was just last week that we discovered that. We are seeing targeting on small and large organizations alike, a top US bank, a top global supermarket chain, thousands of small merchants who are actually de-scoped for the most part, under the SAC-A changes that happened in January of last year in the DSS, and I'll get to that. We're seeing reinfection rates based on our known victims in 2025. Nearly 20% have been reinfected in Q1, with 57% of those reinfections using entirely new malicious code. So it's not like, just refiring, it's, another attempt and, to come in and to, again, fly low and slow, by not allowing maybe any of the ability to sort of like use signature-based detection and things of that nature, to fire off. We're seeing APT style attacks and anti-remediation. And I'll talk about that as we get along here. They're gaining in sophistication. And again, as I mentioned, first and third party services being weaponized. Legitimate services being used for attacks. Definitely, we're seeing, server side controls are starting to fail. And that client side controls not only should be in place for the protection, of the third party compromise, but they can actually be an incredible defense in depth add, for discovering and seeing, compromise to your own code. And so, that's something that you should be thinking about is this is like not just checkbox compliance, right, to do what the DSS says, but it's also like really solid, like WebSec defense in depth. We actually saw 25 unique campaigns in Q1. And so, we saw like what 92 we said in 2025, based on our visibility, we're trending higher and faster than that, in just the first 3 months of the year. I expect we'll continue to see that grow and that, as our visibility increases on the source defense end, we'll find even more. And so I would say, don't take any of these numbers and say like, oh, wow, like only a couple of thousand sites. That's a lot of sites. Or, oh, wow, only 25 unique campaigns. Again, that's our visibility. There could be hundreds or thousands more that we're not seeing out there. But the fact that we're seeing even this much activity should be alarming and should make you take action if you have not and get off, sort of the waiting blocks. One thing, CSP has been weaponized. And so I couldn't resist, it was a great horror movie I loved, the calls coming from inside the house. And what we're seeing is CSP, a supposed control, and I'll talk why I don't think that's a control at all for this problem, which is referenced inside the DSS, and which, there are a lot of solutions built on top of. We actually seen it hijacked to use to continually reestablish foothold on compromised websites. This is through both forensic investigation work that we're supporting, as well as our research, where we're seeing the ability of the adversary to actually insert their own services in the CSP whitelist and continually reinfect based on their foothold there. And so not only is it like a false sense of security, it's actually being weaponized, as a source of the problem. And so very, very important, and we'll dissect some of that as we go along. Got to talk to some like truths here that this research supports. I told you I was going to kind of like speak truth to power. We've written about this. We talk about this all the time. We're very proud that, the DSS even includes a focus on e-skimming because it means we took this seriously. And, we've been very proud of our involvement in the community. And so kudos, for the fact that we've even gotten to this point. But as with anything in compliance, it usually is, the standards usually lag behind the knowledge of what's really going on in the threat. And sometimes, as things are written, they're already antiquated and outdated. And sometimes, it just missed the mark. And so I think in a lot of ways, what's in the DSS is good because it gets us moving towards a solution to the problem. But in a lot of ways, it creates this illusion of e-skimming security. And I think there's a misunderstanding of the threat. I think that the guidance really ignores the voices like ours and other experts in the community, especially those in the PFI space, who are saying, this is not, a sort of singular issue, at an isolated environment. The view that this is about payment pages is very myopic and it's a very static understanding of tradecraft. There's a lot of misguidance that's happening. We think there are controls that have been referenced in the DSS, and for whatever reason, people are sort of taking those and saying, "Well, that's what I'll do" because it calls them out. That should not be in there. We actually think they should be removed. We think there should be an update. We've been calling for that, as have dozens of others in the space for some time now. I don't know if we're going to get there, but you should know it, and you should make your decisions around that knowledge. I think there is, an issue with not addressing the full attack surface. And I think there's a real problem that occurred with a descoping of a critical target community with the SAC-A changes that happened in January. Again, sort of like taking the level 4 community, the mom and pop, and saying, well, you don't really need to do this because it's going to be complex. That's actually a huge attack surface or a huge, sort of target community, if you will. And then, you'll hear the PCI Council say, we are not the compliance reporting authority. They do not know how people, in the community report. They do not know how many level 1 merchants actually invoke, one of the FAQs. I think it's 1333. Don't quote me on that one. It's been a while since I've used the number, but one of the FAQs to basically say that we can report SAC-A for our e-commerce environment. And so because of the SAC-A changes, there's an issue with both sides, with the big organizations and with the small organizations, kind of taking their focus away from this problem and creating somewhat of a shell game, which gets us nowhere. And so really not delivering on true security. And I'll walk through that, as it relates to some of this research, right? The first issue, the controls that don't control. The DSS 4.0.1 uses a reference to CSP, content security policy, and SRI, sub-resource integrity, as controls that may be effective, for e-skimming security. And you'll see them referenced, more than any other, sort of control, if you will, in the 643 and 11.6.1 categories. It's just wrong. It's just bad advice. I just mentioned how CSP is being used even to, hide adversary, activity and to, enable, reinfection and some permanence, in terms of adversarial, compromise. The controls themselves, are outdated, and they cannot stop e-skimming. It's like I would liken it very much to antivirus, like 15 years ago, 20, almost 20 years ago now, when like signatures are dead. And we came to grips with that as a community, and we had to, go, and sort of stop, focusing on like signature-based detection. CSP and SRI, function effectively as whitelist and blacklists. They're static controls. They're unable to track, these evolving attacks. I was on the e-commerce guidance task force. There were 80 of us in there. We all were trying to get, CSP and SRI removed from the reference samples in the DSS. Take it or leave it. If you go down the direction of trying to implement a CSP or an SRI based solution to this problem, you may be getting a checkbox from your either your SAC or from your QSA or whatever. but you're not stopping the problem. And so you will fall victim. I'm just going to be that blunt with it. You will fall victim. On the CSP end of things, it's very difficult to manage. If you even could, it creates breakage. You've got no behavioral awareness. You're effectively saying, I'm going to allow these partners, right, to run these scripts in my environment. And that's just the nature of how these attacks happen. I've laid it out. We're trying to protect the supply chain, but we're saying, well, just whitelist your supply chain, right? And if you whitelist your supply chain, then, you should be good. Well, how does that make any sense, right? It is the partner that gets compromised, who you would have had on your CSP whitelist, that is going to enable these types of attacks. SRI, it requires hashes, okay, and the fingerprint, if you will, right, of all the scripts that you're going to allow to run in your environment. First of all, at line speed, your teams are adding new stuff all the time. Second of all, scripting is dynamic; it is not static. The signature changes thousands and thousands of times, a day. We had one client, who was dealing, if they tried to do this, sort of like with the hashing end of things, there's something like 47,000 script changes in a month because they were managing like 40 domains and they had dozens of partners for each domain. It's just ridiculous. It doesn't work. It's been noted by one of the core authors of the DSS that it doesn't work, and their inclusion in the DSS is misleading you. And so, we've got a document. Scott will put it up there, about the difference between a behavioral based approach and inspecting and understanding what script is doing versus where it comes from, as the really critical way to solve this problem. And we've got a call to action. You can help us with it. If you're on a QSA and you're going to the gear meeting soon and things like that, get loud. Don't let us be the only voice. There are other voices in the space warning about it. Join in the affray. Attackers win because the trust model is the attack vector. They hide inside allowed paths and trusted services. They exploit, the narrow scopes that exist. They leverage the first party trust. They attack your third and fourth party partnerships. Just reiterating, 30 plus Google Tag Manager compromises that happened in 2025 campaigns alone. It is the legitimate services that are abused, and it is the faith that you put in the partner, that is, being used by the bad guy. And increasingly, they're going after, tons and tons of different partners. They're using CDN and edge platforms to host malicious scripts, and they are, using runtime functions, and they are using developer platforms to obfuscate and hide payloads, and they are using messaging services with encrypted connections for exfiltration. Like it is, and it always will be, our reliance on our fellow good guys that enables the bad guy in opportunity. And so, it's something that's got to get looked at. On the Google Tag Manager side of things, if you're not super familiar with it, it is basically centralized control for how scripts are added to your website. And it allows centralized control for the adversary. It becomes a single point for injecting code across all your pages. They can propagate changes like rather immediately, because it's coming from such a name like Google. It's going to bypass other security filters you might have in place. And more than a third of the attacks that we saw in 2025 are relying upon this. It creates the ability to do some really complex stuff too, using containers, legitimate, code, but then, hidden in containers, inside containers to unpack and compile, their malware. It's there, and it should drive home the point around what we think is wrong with this whole notion of like, well, let's whitelist the problem away, right? The other side of it, the scope of the threat. E-skimming occurs site-wide, not just on the payment pages. And so this notion of payment page focus is somewhat of a false sense of security. And, you've heard me say that probably 7 times right now, right? Real world attacks are going after your supply chain, analytics, tag managers, personalization tools. They're not going after payment forms. They don't have to compromise your PSP, in order to conduct these attacks, right? Again, compromised JavaScript is able to do whatever it wants, on the site. Back in 2024, we did a bunch of research with Verizon for the payment security report, their payment security report, and we looked at like 7,000 of the world's largest merchants, and we found, dozens of scripts in place, on average across, every one of those, sort of merchants in every category. We saw, a lot of scripts running on payment pages, which is not necessarily great, but, accessing even payment data and credentials and things of that nature. But the predominant majority of the scripts that are running are not happening there, and are not running in the payment page. And so if you're isolating down, but you're not, so I've got security for the payment, but I've got no security upstream, then I've got no security. Okay, that's just really a message that we want to drive home. You may be compliant, and you're better off than doing nothing. But you really need to expand out and not focus just on, that one sort of isolated environment. I know there's a trend in, PCI to sort of like minimize scope. But in this case, it just really doesn't do it. Iframes don't stop upstream compromise. And so, this notion of like, well, I've got, an iframe, embedded, provided by my payment service provider, that should take care of it. Again, it's not the iframe that's being compromised; it's the website that's being compromised. And there's a great white paper that we did with Coalfire, that Scott can put out for you in the link if he hasn't already. I think this is, supported in threat research, and supported in not just our research, but in research from others. Last year, Security Metrics put out, some data around 2,000, PFIs or forensic investigations that they were involved in related to e-skimming. And these are their words, not ours. In 100% of the cases where e-skimming occurred, the security failure was present on the merchant's referring page, not because of a malicious script on the third-party hosted payment page. Okay. That's them looking at these attacks, cleaning them up, getting called in by the card brands, right? To help come in and save the day because a lot of fraud and a lot of carding has happened. And they're saying it's because of attacks site-wide upstream. So I can't drive that home enough. I'm like the blue in the face site-wide guy. People probably get sick of hearing me say it, but it's just one of those things. It's like I've been in cybersecurity for 17, 18 years now. I've been in IT for almost 30. And, like I believe in solving problems, not giving it lip service. What we're seeing in terms of attacks, silent skimming, the invisible threat, no visible signs, no pop-up, no overlay, no obvious form manipulation, getting more sophisticated, getting, less obvious to the consumer, allowing for, the transaction to actually happen simultaneous to the theft. One of the things in like sort of what we refer to as a double entry attack that kind of flags things is like it's a failed transaction. That's not happening. This is intercepting, and capturing data as it's actually, sort of like, coincidentally or not coincidentally, whatever, at the simultaneously being, given over into the real payment process. We've seen attacks that, change the entire GUI, or the UX for, the site where a new payment option is being implemented. A fake payment method is added to the checkout. It looks like a legitimate payment flow. Mirror image, fake, I'll just use like Stripe as an example, like a fake Stripe, yeah, what am I looking for? iframe, right? Where a user is basically taken away from your site, it's mimicked and spoofed to look like they're still on your site, completely redirected to an adversary, basically C2, right? And the payment card data is captured. The checkout experience looks the same, and then they return the consumer back to you with a failed payment error, forcing them to retry. That's we see that a lot, but again, the silent skimming stuff is what we're seeing more and more on the fake sort of pixel perfect side of things. These skimmers are basically injecting like an exact HTML CSS replica, and they are effectively creating a site within your site. They have, we saw in Q1, malicious scripts running in, WordPress and others that reach inside private sandbox PSP iframes to read data dynamically. And we see like a seamless completion focus, increasing like, transaction succeeds normally, as I mentioned, with the silent skimming side of things, so as to not alert the shopper, to the problem. Um, on issue number three, the sort of shell game side of things, the SAC changes, I think, screwed everything up. It changed 2 months before eligibility deadline. It's caused a lot of people to put things on hold. We do a lot of work with QSAs, and we did a roundtable, I don't know, about 3 4 weeks ago, with our friends over at Trusted Sec. They're seeing a lot of merchant sort of malaise and just heel dragging. It's a real issue. The whole world basically said don't do it. And if you're in that category where it's like well, we were in scope, now we don't know if we're in scope, or we think we're out of scope, or we think we're PSP is going to take care of it, just use everything I've just been rambling on about, as a case that I'm trying to make to you that says do something about this problem. The attacks are happening. The attacks are wide. The attacks are indiscriminate. The attacks are slow and low. The attacks are bypassing controls that you think are controls and they aren't. And you need to do something, because just because you're not seeing it doesn't mean it's not happening to you even right now. One of the other things that we see as a very heavy trend in the way these attacks work is what should I say, like round robining, or better way to say it would be like sampling based theft. So in other words, they're not stealing every transaction that goes across your website. They're stealing every 10th transaction, or every 100th transaction, or every 1,000th transaction, depending upon the size you are as an organization. And so it's really, really under the radar stuff, because you don't have a radar in place. Get moving. One of the things that I think was so alarming, we did some work, with a couple of our partners on this. We did this in Q1. We looked at 10,000 of the world's like sites, and we found that 94% of them still don't have either a client-side security solution in place, or they either have a misconfigured CSP or no CSP. And the misconfigured side is in monitoring mode only, where violations are logged and not blocked. And again, don't think it's control in the first place. Only a couple percent, really had like what we would consider an active client-side security solution in place. So we've got a long way to go, because I've been talking about this problem and talking to the PCI concern for 3.5 4 years now. We were supposed to have a deadline as of April 1st of 2025. I don't know if everybody just thought it was like a April Fool's joke. It wasn't. We got to get moving, and we got to get stuff done, because what we're seeing is industrialization of the e-skimming problem. We're seeing the reach across geographies. We're seeing reach across payment providers. We're seeing reach across all platforms. This isn't like a one-off script kiddie thing. It's becoming a scalable operating model, with infrastructure investment, versioning, new capabilities, advancing in adversarial tradecraft, adoption of APT style techniques, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It's a problem that's at our doorstep, that I think we've got a long way to go to truly solve. And I think we've got to also consider, as I mentioned, the fact that it's not just about card data, but about other forms of content that we are capturing. And we've got to remember that we are the stewards of and the responsible parties of all data that we grab. So I said I'd try and get done around 2:45. I missed it by about 4 minutes. And so I apologize for that. I will shut up now, because I've been talking, and you're probably sick of hearing my voice. If there are any questions, I can definitely take them. As I mentioned, if I didn't get, if I can't do technical enough, we can get you there. But Scott, if you haven't already, if you could throw my email address in the chat, it's steve@sourcedefense.com. I'm available for comment, question, concern, connection to, folks, etc., for anything that you may need. So I'll take a pause.